There's no one-size-fits-all approach to creating a successful fundraising strategy and plan.
People are nervous, right? It's a big deal. We're raising $10 million, even if we're raising $1 or $3 million, depending on the size of the org.
Major gift fundraising is not deadline driven. It really is probably the only type of fundraising, along with planned giving, that is not deadline driven.
AI comes on the scene that's affordable, accessible, that can provide insights and personalization at scale.
That's the first core element of this fundraising engine or funnel, is making sure that the top of your funnel, the beginning of your fundraising process, you are in front of the right people.
What do the people we serve need? And how do we open the door to help them get there?
What happens a lot of times is we get this discomfort or this fear, and our brain tells our body to stop.
We can acquire donors and we can automate everything. And that's where I worry, at least personally, around the perils of AI, that it would remove humans from the interaction.
This is the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast.
Welcome to the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast. Our guest today is someone I have admired for many years, none other than Alan Clayton. Alan is a world-renowned nonprofit consultant, author, and entrepreneur with extensive fundraising and nonprofit leadership experience. He currently serves as the CEO of Revolutionize, a company he founded in 2008 after spending a decade running a full-service agency. Alan's fundraising and organizational development expertise has led him to work with over 320 charities, NGOs, and nonprofits worldwide. His international reach extends to Africa, Australia, Finland, Norway, Ireland, Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, and the US, of course, among others. That's a very long list. We might as well just say the globe. In January of this year, Alan published his book, Great Fundraising Organizations: Why and How the World's Best Charities Excel at Raising Money. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Before we jump in, I want to share something from another pioneering fundraiser, Roger Craver. You may know him from his blog, The Agitator. Roger wrote an incredible and lengthy review of Alan's book, and I want to share just a brief snippet from that review. Roger wrote, "This isn't just a book for fundraisers, although every serious fundraiser should buy, read, reread, and heed. It's for anyone who's tried to change something and wondered why it's so hard. It's for leaders who feel stuck, for teams who've lost their way. It's for anyone who's looked at the world and thought there has to be a better way." Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much indeed, Tammy. Thanks very much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, well, we're delighted to have you. So let's just jump in. If you'll start by telling us about the inspiration for writing this book.
It was a long time in the coming, and then a light bulb moment. It had frustrated me for years, the organizations I had worked in and organizations I had worked with couldn't grow their fundraising. And I didn't know why. And I'd observed that you could have two organizations with a similar mission fundraising in the same country or the same market, and one of them could be raising hundreds of millions a year, and the other one could be trundling along at a very small state. And why don't they raise the same if they're doing the same thing in the same market? And then I read From Good to Great by Jim Collins, as so many people have, who, of course, studied that phenomenon in the commercial sector. So I quickly went to work testing out some of his ideas to see if this worked with fundraising nonprofits, and some did and some didn't. So I came to the conclusion there's a different type of leadership involved in leading a fundraising nonprofit that is growing in a transformational manner. We had some insights working on it ourselves, until I met Professor Adrian Sargent, and I put to him our hypothesis that the single driver of large-scale fundraising growth was actually the internal behavior of the organization, rather than the market and the product, for lack of a better word. And he was kind enough to undertake that work with our investment, and the whole story unfolded. Whole story unfolded from there.
Amazing. Well, and certainly, Dr. Sargent does incredible work.
Yeah.
So, kind of explain this concept of a great fundraising organization and how it differs from other nonprofits. What were some of the distinctions of the internal characteristics that made the difference between those that were phenomenally successful and those that struggled?
Yeah. First of all, the definition of a great fundraising organization, it's not just enough to have been big because you've been around for 200 years. You've got to have intentionally driven very large scale growth, enough to impact the mission of the organization, and done it with a set of subsidiary criteria that mean it's done permanently and ethically. So it's that intentionality to grow that is the difference. The first insight, right at the beginning, and this insight drives the difference in behaviors between the great and the rest, all the way through without a break, is that the organizations that fail, they see themselves as being a single business, and all they have to do to get money is ask for it. And people will give because our organization is great at what it does, because it's trustworthy, because it's credible. And what they have missed is that no donor gives money to an organization. Donors give money to solve a problem. The organization just happens to be a trusted, effective way of doing so. But those organizations that are selling, and I'm doing air quotes as I say selling, that are selling their organization as the fundraising product, they're the ones that struggle. The ones that succeed, and this was intuitive until we'd done 4 or 5 rounds of research and were able to present back to those studied what we observed they'd been doing. They intuitively knew that the fundraising nonprofit is 2 businesses with 1 mission and 1 governance structure. One business is in the business of meeting the needs of service users or beneficiaries. And of course, you have to be best in market at doing that. The other business is in the business of meeting the emotional needs of donors. And you need to be the best in market at doing that. Somewhere in the 1990s, we started to suffer a crisis of self-confidence in fundraising, and we started to bring in expertise from the commercial sector. And they told us to integrate one culture, bring down the silos, have one message for the whole organization. And that's where it all went wrong. Before then, fundraisers intuitively knew about the 2 businesses, 1 mission, but we've spent 30 or 40 years trying to integrate 2 businesses which should not be integrated. The great fundraising organizations are just the best at being both, meeting the needs of service users and meeting the needs of donors.
So when we talk about meeting the needs of donors, this is top of mind because I'm doing some work right now around what I'm calling human-centered fundraising and really leaning into the whole power dynamic paradigm.
Yeah.
What's your point of view on, meeting the emotional needs of donors and balancing the power dynamics? Because sometimes meeting the emotional needs of donors can lead to mission creep and taking us off that one mission. What are your insights about that?
My insight is purpose is boss. I mean, if you go around chasing money and allowing donors to mission creep, then more fool you.
Yeah.
Of course, that's easy to say if your purpose and therefore the problem you're trying to solve is clearly defined, focused, and unique, or as close to unique as you can possibly be. Then you have a clear decision-making criteria. So making purpose boss. Where that becomes difficult is if a nonprofit has previously mission crept so that its purpose is unclear, or its purpose is defined in such a way as to be all-encompassing and compromised to meet the needs of everybody, in which case it's unclear. But if your purpose is crystal clear and precise, then that tells you what donations you should accept or not. It's as simple as that. I need to follow that up with a key to success is respect for the emotional needs of donors. That doesn't mean respect for the opinions of donors. The emotional needs of donors and opinions of donors are very different things. The emotional needs to give, which 99% of us have, are beautiful. They're wonderful. Everybody wins by facilitating the emotional need to contribute to something greater than ourselves, whether it's our local church, our local community, whether it's to a cause in country or in state or indeed global, and they're different for different people. But meeting those emotional needs to give are not the same as kowtowing to the opinions of people seeking power, for sure.
Such a powerful distinction.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the importance of organizational alignment
Yeah.
in the book. How can nonprofits achieve this alignment between their missions and their fundraising efforts?
Okay, so this is the fact that the two businesses are not even different, but they're actually mirror images of each other. And the one of them, the service user, needs to sell the solution that the organization is providing and do that with trust and credibility. Where the evidence is quite clear that the fundraising department needs to sell the problem with incredibility. The two things couldn't be less compatible, and that's where all the internal conflict comes from. Our research is emphatic on this. First of all, mutual respect.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Kindsight builds technology that helps nonprofits make a difference. It was born when three leading-edge nonprofit technologies, iWave, Ascend, and Nonprofit OS, came together to better support organizations with purpose-built tools designed to make fundraising easier, faster, and more effective. With a combined 40 years working with nonprofits and other fundraising organizations, we have seen the generosity landscape evolve and change in ways we never could have predicted. It's become clear that the best approach to fundraising is a personalized and meaningful one, a human approach. But that's not easy when goals are high and resources are scarce. That's where Kindsight comes in. With Kindsight, fundraisers can find and qualify potential donors with the world's largest proprietary donor database, engage with those donors quickly and effectively with AI-powered content generation, and keep everything on track with a centralized CRM built specifically for fundraising teams. Connect your story to donors who care about your cause at any scale in real time. That's the power of Kindsight.
The service users are not the only professionals in the organization. Fundraisers are professionals too. And second, that service users are not the only people with value, that donors have value too. So there's a mutual respect that needs to be there. And if that is not balanced, you have a problem. Second is mutuality of purpose. The purpose of the organization and the ambition for fundraising and the theory of change for the services department. We are, again, crystal clear from our 100 deep dive case studies that will never be found, that common purpose will never be found rationally. It's an emotional thing. It's an emotionally driven purpose. So the ability for both businesses to work in the emotional space until the magic pops is absolutely critical. And third, this will surprise you, Tammy, because we spent 10,000 of our good British pounds researching this. And we discovered that they talk to each other.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. But it sounds flippant. But actually, when you go back and compare that to the 400 organizations we've done action research on, right enough, in the organizations that get paralyzed, communication is primarily by memoranda, email, backbiting at the water cooler, passive-aggressive out-of-meeting behavior, and terminally ineffective reply to all email. Whereas actually the great organizations, because they had that mutual respect for professionalism and for donors and service users, they were able to sit in rooms together and talk through until they got the most powerful fundraising messaging, fundraising investment, fundraising culture, and they did it together. And they actually became extremely good at that real life human communication, which brought respect for different businesses and cultures, but most of all, respect for the common purpose.
So what role does leadership play in bringing those two business units, if you will, together and finding that mutuality of service and respect?
It's absolutely critical. There's a huge pivot on the chief executive officer, or the president, as they're often called. They're often called over in the US. There's a very rare occasion where the president or chief executive brings a fundraising or commercial background, and that is fairly straightforward to work with them to frame these conflicts and the solutions to them. More often than not, the chief executive has come to an organization through the service user side. So they have not had the experience nor education in how you drive rapid financial growth, not because they're incapable of it, but because of their career history. However, the career history doesn't necessarily make them incapable, but it does on occasion make them unwilling. So the successful organizations have a chief executive who basically says, this is as senior a post as I can possibly get as an expert in providing services. The only way I can further both my mission and my career now is to educate myself on how I lead a rapid growth fundraising organization. And in the last 10 years, every single chief exec who's chosen to do that has succeeded in transforming their revenue. Every single one.
Wow. Wow. All right. So, Alan, one of the things I most admire about you is your ability to tell stories, to move and inspire, and to take the data, the logic, the theory of change, and craft it into a story that people just get it. So I want you to tell us a story about a nonprofit that really did transform into a great fundraising organization, and the steps that they took. 100% of these presidents or chief executives, when following the process, made it. So tell us about one.
I'd like to tell you about one that's not in the book, because there are plenty, including some notable names in the USA that have achieved this. But I'd like to talk to you about one that's in the early days, and it is a nonprofit called Labre Indian School, based up in Montana. It is a high school for the young people who are in the Crow and Northern Cheyenne people on the often referred to as reservations. I prefer the word nations for them. And they have had a history of success in fundraising, but over the years it's become to be seen as somewhat distasteful and limiting to growth, to portray the children as innocent victims, basically, and portraying the need and the problem has become harder and harder. And there was a huge conflict between the need to portray the school as successful and credible, and also to describe the problem that St. Labre is trying to solve. So what one does to bring that unity, to bring the two things together to a corporate purpose, is go back in and say, what actually is the problem you're trying to solve? Now, the problems that they are trying to solve at St. Labre Indian School are various and entrenched. There is intergenerational poverty, going back a very, very long time. There is all the social ills and mental health problems that go with that kind of property and a lack of self-purpose. And there's a real feeling that many of the young people in the communities are just not ready for the world as they grow up, or indeed when they graduate or otherwise from high school. What's critical is finding this problem in the right emotional space. So the interesting opening to this was the ability of our team to, please excuse the British phrase, but to get down and dirty with the young people from St. Labre. And what's obvious is they're sitting up there in Montana. They've had relatively little communication with anybody else. And they were very downbeat and despondent because they felt they were the only people who have this problem. That they have their land that they wanted, their traditional land to live on, but there's no way to live on that land and make a living. And that's causing great despondency. And we had to point out to them that we see this problem all over the world. Yeah. And you create the emotional space by telling stories. So I told them stories about Alexandria Township outside Cape Town, which is exactly the same. I told them stories about Transylvania in Romania, which is exactly the same as our traditional land, no way to make a living. And finally, I told them a story of my home turf, which is the Highlands of Scotland, which was famously cleared of people to make way for sheep after we lost the Battle of Culloden 200 years ago, and our population dropped from 1.2 million to 100,000. We were the only successful ethnic cleansing in Europe. And of course, those Scots have been very successful around the world since. But you got that moment of empathy when they realized that what happened to my people was exactly the same that has happened to historically to the Crow and the Northern Cheyenne. So suddenly we had a shared emotional space and critically belief that there might be a solution to this. And the other people in the world are working to solve it with varying degrees of success. So we then dive into, okay, we're in the emotional space, tell us the stories. And the stories were heartbreaking. Really were. I won't risk triggering anyone on your podcast, Tammy, but the mental health stories, the poverty stories, the family breakdown, the loss of hope, it was absolutely heartbreaking. But alongside that was the resilience of the community leaders, the resilience of the teachers at the high school was very, very inspiring, particularly those teachers who'd come from the local community and were just doing everything they can to get some kind of success. And then came the big moment. It's, what problem are you trying to solve? And in the group discussion, it came up with, well, not enough of our kids go to graduate high school and go to college. And for a few moments that went unchallenged until, and this is the magic of working in the emotional space, somebody in the group, I remember him vividly, he said, not that there's any point in getting anybody to graduate from high school and go to college anyway. And it was like, why not? And he said, they hate it. Our kids graduate, we send them off to college, and they come back because they don't want to be off at Dartford or Yale or wherever it is. They don't fit. The culture shock is socially terminal for them. And so even if we get 2, 3, or 4 more a year that graduate high school and go to college, it's not going to make any difference to anybody, because they go there, they don't like it, they drop out, and they come back. And that was the moment. Cue a very loud discussion that went on for a very long time, and then quote of the century from one of the very senior people, a guy who was Crow, who just dumbfounded the room, and he said, he used some very powerful words. I shall skip those out. He said, I cannot believe that we have spent so long trying to use the white man's solution for a Native American problem.
Mic drop.
Mic drop moment. Absolute silence in the room, and it was, please explain. And he said, if you're from the other America, then your greatest success is to get your kids into the best college. The greatest success for us is getting our kids to stay in Montana and earn a living, because without that, we will never have sustainable nations for the Crow and Northern Cheyenne people. Cue an amazing discussion, because what they had just discovered, of course, is micro business. Yeah. Which, of course, is the solution in Alexandria Township. It's the solution here in the Highlands. And so they realized that, yes, there's a place for academia at St. Labre, but the greatest contribution they can make is actually providing vocational training so that people can stay in Montana and build the economy, build a country. I'm going on quite a bit now. I could talk about this story for a day if you'd like me to, and maybe we will when we get the opportunity. But in short, they changed their purpose from please help us get a few more kids to college to please help us educate a generation of our young people who will grow up to be the leaders that finally make our nations proud, prosperous, and free.
Wow. Goosebumps. So powerful.
And the question was, do you think you can fundraise for that? The answer is yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as you said earlier, donors give to solve a problem.
To solve a problem.
Yeah.
And one of the great unsolved problems is that the Native American nations in general are far from proud, prosperous, and free.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. And of course, there are so many other great stories in the book. It's such a beautifully written book. And I think the stories really bring it to life, bring the research and the data to life.
Yeah.
Alan, talk with us about the balance between short-term fundraising goals and long-term organizational sustainability. I think we struggle with this.
Yeah, it's rooted in the fact that nonprofit accountability is based on a 1 year cycle and fundraising growth is driven on a multi-year cycle. You have to do both. You have to account as the government requires and as your directors require. The way we advise people to do this is decide what problem you're trying to solve 5, 7, 10 years from now, figure out how much money you need in order to achieve that, and then do the mathematics backwards. And that'll tell you what you need to do short term in order to where you want to be 5, 7, and 10 years. So what's required there is a shift in mindset at board level. And the legal responsibility of boards is quite simply to account for the money we spent last year. Yep, that's it. So that's a governance mindset. If the board want to solve the problem the non-profit is there to solve, it needs to adopt a growth mindset from governance to growth. And that involves multi-year thinking. Fundraising is an investment-driven business. It's a wonderful return on investment as long as you're prepared to look over the appropriate timescale. So it's a choice of the board to look at that. So in short, you need to be expert at both. If you would like a real shortcut for it, which is something we teach in our Accelerate with Purpose masterclass, is an observation that the most successful organizations, they don't run their fundraising on a 12-month or 36-month cycle. They have a 10-year aspirational goal for revenue, which once set never changes. And then the detail of the fundraising program seems to change every fiscal quarter, every 90 days or so. And we observed this, the ability to be very rapid and agile in the short term, but never change the long-term goal is the magic skill. And once we'd identified that, I read another one of the business books. I think it was either Scaling Up or it was the Rockefeller Habits. And they'd identified this in corporate land as well, that the 12-year budget year is only there for accountability to the authorities. And what drives fundraising is both the 10-year investment-driven growth goal and the agility of working on short-term 90-day plans to optimize short-term results.
Mm-hmm. Given the challenges, at least here in the US, around tenure, whether it's fundraiser tenure or even executive director tenure, having an aspirational 10-year, 12-year goal feels a little scary, a little risky. And I feel like we are so risk averse, at least here in the US. And many of my international friends find that their organizations are risk averse as well. So, how do we get our boards and our executive leadership to embrace both this short term and long term view and kind of bookend our work in that framework?
Yeah, well, with the board, because you can't affect the tenure of a board, all you can do is take it away from governance to legacy and say, how do you want the world to be different when you finish your tenure on the board than it was at the beginning? Do you want to say I successfully managed a organization's balance sheet, or do you want to say the world is measurably better because of me? So you challenge them on the achievement. For all paid staff, you need to increase tenure. But we have researched how to do this because the great fundraising organizations, they keep their fundraising staff typically 4 times longer than the rest do. And one of our subsidiary pieces of research was called What Makes Fundraisers Tick and how do you retain and inspire fundraisers? there are a number of criteria, and interestingly, the financial terms and conditions are very low on the list for driving tenure. Number one is cause connection. They joined the job because of the cause connection. They need constantly reminded it. If they join a job for cause connection and then their job just becomes about spreadsheet, they lose their mojo. Second is they need a chance to succeed. Nobody's going to stay if they feel like they're banging their head against a brick wall all the time. And then third, and arguably for me, is respect from colleagues across the entire organization, and not constantly having to justify their investment, or worst, fighting in terminal battles about what we can and cannot say in our communications. So those three things really. So cause connection, the chance to succeed, which is realistic targets, and stretch targets, really push them hard,
Mm-hmm.
make sure that it's that they're ahead of the curve rather than behind it all the time. But that third, that mutual respect from other departments, rather than being seen as the necessary evil that goes out begging to be recognized as the professionals they are. Those three things need to be in place. In short, there's a chicken and egg here, in that a great fundraising organization creates increased tenure, and increased tenure creates a great fundraising organization. It all starts with two businesses, one mission, and the understanding again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Discuss the concept of that red dot moment.
We call it the red dot moment. I'm sorry, this really isn't very academic. It's called a red dot moment because the first time we identified it, I used a red Sharpie to mark out our chart. It's stayed there ever since. The red dot, it's a key board meeting that signals that the organization has become aligned. So the three key conflicts between fundraising and everybody else in every fundraising nonprofit in the world are the cultural conflict between one type of business and the other. There's the investment conflict, the why should we spend money on fundraising when lives need to be saved now? And then there's the communications conflict between one business talks about the problem, one talks about the solution. So in order to gain investment from any quality board, you need to be able to show three things, and they happen to represent those three conflicts. That we have the right idea, the big purpose or the big ambition, the people are right, which means that we've solved these cultural conflicts, and you need to have the business plan, which is the investment plan. So in order for the board to make the investment that triggers massive fundraising growth, all boards need to have confidence in those three things. That requires organizational alignment. So the red dot is the moment that it is recognized that the organization has now accepted its two businesses with one mission and has become aligned in pursuit of that one mission, and therefore the board can make the necessary decisions.
So good.
It's the moment. That's the long answer. The short answer is it's the moment that the complex became simple again, and the emotional energy of the organization moved from being pointed internally at self-criticism to being pointed externally at a common dream.
So powerful. I think if you ever are looking to rename the red dot moment, I think it might be the moment angels sing. Right? Like, it's so profound.
Yeah.
So how can smaller nonprofits apply the principles that you talk about in the book and improve their fundraising?
It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. I guess the two things that smaller organizations have a disadvantage is it's more difficult for them to recruit fundraising professionals, but you do need a professional. So, if budget is a limit, you at least consider quality training for people that you do recruit, even if you can't recruit at the pay level required to get the very experienced fundraisers. And second, of course, is investment. So there are ways to get around the investment thing. One of the most effective being an agreement to rapidly recycle fundraised income for a period until it reaches a certain critical mass. So, X percent, a high percentage of what fundraising brings in goes back into fundraising expansion until we reach a certain size. That's very common.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that that's most effective in organizations that view fundraising as an investment versus an expense.
Absolutely. As an expense or even opportunistic. There's an education of the board required by big nonprofits and the small ones to view it and take that multi-year view. If it's viewed as an expense, then you get the situation we see at the moment where some nonprofits are having to scale back because of the global financial picture. And some of them, the programs department say, well, how come we're making cuts in programs and not in fundraising? The organizations that say, oh, we need to be fair. If we're cutting programs by X, we need to cut fundraising. Well, they're just creating the terminal spiral of a slow and painful death, frankly. It's the job of leadership to say, well, actually, when money's tight, we need to invest more in making the money. And that's the leadership job to speak to the rest of the organization about that. Mm-hmm. So that's an extreme situation, but I'm bringing up because I know it's very real to a lot of nonprofits right now. And the second one, of course, is when fundraising is seen as a knee jerk. So, and this is typically in smaller organizations when you say, oh, just recruit a fundraiser. And they recruit someone to fairly basic specification, and they're left with no budget, no support, and just expected to do magic in the same fiscal year. Not going to happen.
Yeah.
So the multi-year view is the answer to all those questions. Simple as that. And if leadership don't understand that, then they need to.
Yeah. I've often found it helpful. I mean, it all comes back to this common thread that the book and our conversation keeps coming back to, and that is just the importance of organization-wide communication.
Yes, but not any old communication.
Yes.
It's got to come from that shared goal, so that whenever there's a conflict, you can go back to that shared goal or shared purpose, and that will make all the decisions for you. Mm-hmm. But yeah, absolutely. And I'm really going to emphasize here the importance of people speaking to each other. I'm really sorry. I know that some people prefer to sit at home texting and WhatsApping, but speaking to people either on video like we're doing or actually getting together in real life, it is so essential. Mm-hmm. And we can see quite clearly, even if it's not return to office 5 days a week, the great fundraising organizations, they get people together regularly, because that's how you get quality communication. That's how everybody gets their voice heard. That's how you get decisions made and can move at a pace.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how you build trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Completely. Oxytocin, I think they call it, Tammy.
Yes, indeed.
It doesn't come through a screen. We're laughing because we've met together in real life a number of times before. Had we not done that, it would be more difficult. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So true. Can you talk about the importance of donor-centric approaches in fundraising as you outline in the book?
Okay, we now talk about donor conscious rather than donor centric, because we've been made aware there's a confusion between two different definitions of donor centric, particularly in the US. From the great fundraising perspective, donor conscious or donor centered, that means being expert at meeting the emotional needs of donors. It in no way means allowing donors to dictate the strategic operation of the organization or the spend. So that's all that it means. The decision to give, whether it's $1 or $10 million, the decision to make a gift is always emotional. It's always there to make an emotional need. Even in a foundation, that decision was emotional. It might have been made 100 years ago, but the decision to set up the foundation was an emotional one. Rational thinking is about overcoming the objections to giving once somebody has emotionally decided to do so. So what we talk about being a donor conscious organization is the fundraisers know what donor needs so they can deliver on it, but also a recognition that the rest of the organization provides fundraising what it needs in order to meet the needs of the donors. So if the rest of the organization is unwilling or unable to provide fundraising what it needs, then fundraising can't meet the needs of the donor. So a donor conscious organization is one where the whole organization respects, understands, and acts on the needs of the donor to provide the fundraising department with the ability to be the best.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense. And I suspect on that list would be measuring programmatic outcomes, providing budgets for grant applications,
Yeah.
just general collaboration, like finding ways to curate and share stories in an ethically
There's
sound manner.
the impact measures and such, like, sure, particularly for major donors, but the big one is stories.
Yeah, stories.
Not sanitized, filtered case studies. Yeah, not distanced from people. Real stories about the problem and real stories about the.
And now for a final word from our sponsor.
Every fundraiser knows that the secret to success lies in creating authentic connections. This starts with data, but that data needs to turn into insights that inspire action, which in turn fosters generosity and long-term donor relationships. Kindsight's fundraising intelligence solution lets any nonprofit do just that at any scale, with the world's largest proprietary donor database, AI-powered content generation, an award-winning CRM built specifically for fundraising teams, and much more. Go to kindsight.io to see it in action.
Solution, and preferably told in the first person in the voice of the service user with experience of either or both of the problem and the solution, and not the opinion of somebody in the middle about how we should speak. It's an amazing strategy, Tammy. It's called the truth well told. Just tell us the truth and we'll tell it well, and then the donors will get what they need. And it is actually that simple, for sure.
Yeah, I love it. So tell us about how the book helps us address the challenges of fundraising in different cultural contexts and international settings.
Okay, so what we've done is we've looked at the intuition of successful people over 30 or 40 years and turned that into patterns. Everybody I've spoken to recognizes the conflicts and the confusion and the difficulty in making stuff happen. So the feedback I've had so far is what this does is take my world and give me a clear path to navigate it. Yep, that's what it is. There's data and stories, because data gives trust and stories create action. And we would like people to do both. So a clear pathway to building a great fundraising organization, and it's very clear. It's a section of steps, and so far every organization that's completed them has transformed their income. I'm going to touch wood as I say that, but so far that is the case. If you would like the more candid answer, the book is written so that the fundraiser will learn something, they will feel noticed, and they will pass it on to their chief executive or board and say, you need to read that.
Yeah.
Because more than anything, that's what the fundraiser needs.
Yeah. And it really does, to your point, takes all of us to really transform into a great fundraising organization.
Yeah.
And obviously the reason for that is to make the biggest impact possible, solve the problem we are aiming to solve.
Absolutely. And the biggest benefit of having been doing this for so long is every now and then we solve a problem. It's and I've never done it in the same financial year. It's always been that multi-year process that requires an awful lot of money. But every now and then we have succeeded in achieving the mission of an organization, and that's a wonderful feeling for a long in the tooth fundraiser.
Well, I don't like to think of myself as long in the tooth, but we have been at it about a while for sure.
I was just being falsely humble there. I still think of myself as 21-year-old in Philippines.
Love it. So, what I'm hearing, Alan, is that this journey it takes intention.
Yes.
It takes courage.
Yes.
It takes all of us, and it takes tenacity. This is a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would add to that, it takes focus.
Focus. Yes. Yes. I love that. Yeah. Well, Alan, what a gift you are, and what a gift this amazing book is. Thank you for writing it. Roger Craver was right. I already want to reread it.
Excellent.
Yes. Yes.
You know what? It doesn't cost any more to read it twice.
This is true. All right. At the end of each episode, I like to ask a few rapid fire questions just to provide even more value to our listeners. So I'm ready if you're ready.
Go for it.
All right. The first question is, Alan, what's the best fundraising advice you've ever received?
It is that good enough is not good enough.
Mm.
That we do not do things sloppily or slowly or cheaply because we're in the voluntary sector. Our service users and our donors are very, very important people and they deserve the best.
Yeah, very good. What book do you recommend to our audience and why, aside from the obvious suggestion?
Yes. Once you've read Great Fundraising Organizations and discovered the importance of emotion, and this will be an unusual recommendation for you, Tammy. This is a book called A First Rate Madness. And the name of the author has completely slipped my mind. I'm very sorry.
We'll
It's a
link
book,
to it. We'll find it and link to it in the show
if you look
notes.
at it, it's a book called First Rate Madness, which is done by a forensic psychologist or a forensic psychiatrist. And it's looking at the link between mental illness and leadership. And what becomes crystal clear is there are two types of leaders in the world. There are those that manage the peace and those that manage the war, or those that manage the time of calm and those that manage rapid change. In times of peace or times of calm, the logical, thoughtful leader wins every time. But in times of rapid change or in times of war, it's the emotional leader that wins every time. And I just want to ask whether fundraising is operating in a time of constant or whether the whole purpose of fundraising always is to create rapid change.
Mm. Yeah.
That book led me to conclude that my emotional instability has actually been my greatest strength.
I love that. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. I certainly can. What are the three most important traits a successful fundraiser must possess?
Belief, number one. Belief in the cause and self-confidence in them, their organization, and their team in order to drive revenue and growth. I'm going to put two, resilience, which is a much overused phrase these days. And if we had an hour, I would explain what resilience is, but a lot of it is the people around you, etc., etc. But the ability to keep going. And I'm going to put three, which is a sense of humor, because we live in a world, if you didn't laugh, you would cry. If you could laugh your way through fundraising, you stand a chance of coming out at the end of a fundraising career without being very ill through vicarious trauma. So, yeah, belief, resilience, and a sense of humor.
And a sense of humor. What's your favorite fundraising application or tool?
I don't have any, Tammy. Sorry.
Yeah. Just listening to you today.
Okay, my favorite fundraising tool is that old-fashioned collecting can where you put coins in the top and it rattles as you fill it up. That's my favorite fundraising application.
I love it. What's your favorite conference and why? And I know you've spoken at many conferences.
My favorite conference and why? My favorite conference is actually the Central European Conference. Emerging fundraising markets, great enthusiasm, openness, willing to learn, and none of the ego or political games that bedevil so many of our other conferences.
Yeah, I've actually heard that a couple of times. Tony Myers, Kay Sprinkle Grace, of course, David Kravenchuk, they all rave about it. So
yeah, I could add many more. Conferences with a great atmosphere. I hesitated before answering in that by far the best seminars I've done in terms of personal enjoyment have been in South Africa, but it's not officially a conference as yet. So
interesting. All right, last question. Knowing what you know now about fundraising, what advice would you give your younger self just getting started in the profession?
Spend less time worrying about what other people think about you and more time taking satisfaction that every time you do something well, the world gets slightly better.
Love that. Thank you, Alan. It has been pure joy to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. It always is, Tammy. Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, our pleasure for sure. If you want to learn more about Alan, his company Revolutionize, get your own copy of his brilliant book, Great Fundraising Organizations, Why and How the World's Best Charities Excel at Raising Money. If you want to follow him on LinkedIn Or if you want to learn more about any of the resources that we've discussed today, just check out the links in the show notes. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast. Keep on transforming your fundraising so you can transform the world.
The Intentional Fundraiser Podcast is a Fundraising Transformed original. I'm Trent Thompson, the executive producer and CMO and head of community at Fundraising Transform. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Visit fundraisingtransform.com to get resources mentioned during this episode and subscribe to our Scaling Major Gifts newsletter.